not at all hyperbolic to say that in the last 5 years, we have gone from being primarily an analog to primarily a digital industry. All right, that's sort of that's the foundational point. That's why this is a remarkable moment in healthcare. As I said, I've been looking forward to this, and it happened, and what got me interested was sort of my sense that it wasn't working out as well as all of us had hoped. So let me give you a few snippets of things I discovered along the way that made this idea of unanticipated consequences and it's harder than it looked real. This is Rich Barron. Some of you know Rich. Rich is now the CEO of the American Board of Internal Medicine, a very tough job. Prior to that, though, he had a tougher job. He was the lead physician in a 4-person general medicine practice outside of Philadelphia. And Rich is kind of an early adopter sort of guy, and well before the $30 billion of incentives, he decided he was going to computerize his small 4-person primary care office. And so they did, and they bought the best system for small ambulatory practices, and they tried to think about all their workflows and work processes, and then they installed the system. And Rich said to me, the staff came to work one day and nobody knew how to do their job. I thought an incredibly interesting statement, because what it says is that when you digitize probably anything, but in healthcare, you think that you're basically just digitizing your analog processes, but you're not. You actually have to completely reimagine the way you do your work, the way information flows, who's doing what. And I said to Rich, like what? And he said, the Post-it notes. Like our business actually ran on Post-it notes. And once the computers came in, there was no longer a place for the Post-it notes. You had to think about all those things you put on Post-it notes and where they went in the system. And so I said, but couldn't you have anticipated that? He said, we tried. Believe me, we tried. And the vendor said, try to think about all your workflows. He says, but you can't do it. Until you're in a digital environment, you don't understand how it's transforming your work. That was one of the first points I came to recognize, that we didn't get it right, partly because we didn't have that vision, and therefore what did we do? We just digitized our clunky analog processes and made them, if anything, a little bit clunkier. Here's a study that came out a year or two ago. ER physicians spent 44% of their time entering data into electronic medical records, thunderously clicking up to 4,000 times during a 10-hour shift. If you talk to any frontline clinician, they will tell you that this has in some ways ruined their life, because they're spending all of their time being data entry clerks into clunky EHRs. There was very little consideration about how this is going to transform the nature of the work. Okay, so I don't know if there are any old-time pen people here. A few that recognize Wally. So when I was a medical student here, there was no question that the central hub of the hospital, the University of Pennsylvania, was not in the mahogany-lined C-suite. It was not in the OR of the most famous cardiac surgeon. It was in the decidedly unglamorous chest reading room in the radiology department, where every day this gentleman, Wally Miller, whose son is now on your faculty, held court, basically. And the way this worked, for those of you who aren't clinicians, if I was on a medicine team, as I was as a medical student, we would see all of our patients in the morning, and then we'd go down to radiology on rounds. And Wally'd be sitting there in his swivel chair, and he'd say, what team are you on? And you'd say, I'm on medicine team C. And he'd put his foot on a little button on the floor, and that gizmo behind him, which is called an alternator, it's kind of like the thing in your dry cleaner except on its side, would spin around until your films came up, and then with intense backlighting, you would see them. And then he'd say, tell me what's going on. And if I'm the medical student, I'd present, I'd say, oh, this is a 42-year-old woman with lupus who comes in with shortness of breath and a cough. And he says, what do you think she's got? And I'd say, pneumonia. And he'd say, nah. And he'd say, look at this. And he'd show you the film, and he would say, this looks like tuberculosis or fungus. And we would talk about it. And those exchanges were magical. He was an amazingly great teacher. It was not only us as the frontline clinicians learning from the radiologists and their wisdom, but them learning from us as well. Because they could read the film in a vacuum, but it was that exchange. It was them asking us what's going on clinically and then opining on what the film showed in the context of the clinical story. It was that back and forth that was wonderful. Over the course of really a couple of weeks after digital radiology began, those rounds ended. Nobody said that they should end. Nobody thought ending them was a good idea. It just turned out that because we didn't have to go to radiology anymore to see our film, because there was no film, there was a ubiquitous image, infinitely scalable, We could see it wherever, and so we didn't realize that it was really the film being in that place that tethered us to that geography. The rounds ended. But here's the part that I think was a surprise to us. Social relationships and communication patterns that previously depended on gathering around the thing will absolutely predictably wither. In this case, radiology rounds were the thing that we hadn't realized, but really were about gathering around this artifact called a film. It no longer existed as a film. The communication pattern withered. You might say, oh, no big deal. Well, power relationships, this is where it starts getting interesting. Power relationships mediated by who controls the thing will be renegotiated. What do I mean by that? In the old days, the radiologists completely controlled the ecosystem of radiology. You wanted to look at a film, you had to go to Radiology World, and they controlled your access to the film. Now they don't. So what does that mean? Well, I can tell you what it means in our place. It means that an orthopedic surgeon sees an X-ray of a fracture. And right now, the radiologists also look at that X-ray and do another reading and bill for it. Well, let's say we're now under a new financial arrangement where we're being paid a fixed amount of money to take care of a patient with a fracture. We begin to ask, do the radiologists really need to also look at that X-ray when the orthopedic surgeon is perfectly good at reading it? And the answer is probably going to be no. Pretty quickly, once it's digital, you begin to ask the question, do the radiologists really need to be in our building? And then very quickly you say, do they really need to be in our country? The average US radiologist, anybody know what they earned last year? About $400,000 a year. The average radiologist in India, anybody know what they earned last year? About $40,000 a year. Are the US radiologists really 10 times better? We're going to find out. Will a person be the entity that looks at the set of pixels and decides that this pattern is lung cancer or not, versus a machine? Well, if we figure out how to have a driverless car, it seems almost inconceivable to me that we will not figure out how to solve that problem with technology. So the parts of medicine that I think are at the greatest risk for technological being supplanted by technology are those that are about visual pattern recognition. That's radiology, dermatology, and pathology are probably the first to go. Here's another part of the world that has changed. I see Peter smiling there. He remembers this very well. So this is the residents' hangout room at UCSF Medical Center. It is filled morning, noon, night, middle of the night with residents doing their computer work. This is on the 9th floor of the hospital. The patients are all on the 14th floor. They see the patients and they escape to their tribal room to do their work. That's fine, except this is the ward, which is empty, devoid of doctors. Because the minute the doctors are done, they now leave the floor to do their work. Why? In the old days, they had to hang out here because this is where the nurse's station was, which is where the paper chart was, which is where they did all of their work, where they wrote their notes, read the labs, read the consult notes. Now they are no longer tethered to the floor by virtue of the paper record, and therefore they leave. Is that a big deal? I think so, because we spent a lot of energy trying to improve the collaboration between the nurses and the doctors. This is a hand grenade thrown in all of those efforts. Just the point really being that the geography communication really changes once you go digital, and you have to think about that, which I can tell you we gave it no thought whatsoever when we went digital.